Salutations and fist bumps, folks. Welcome back to The Grid, and Loki Season 2 Episode 1 was a landslide of what the heck is going on. There are references to the X-Men, Wanda, Moon Knight, possible references to Across the Spider-Verse. Let's get right into this. Grab your popcorn. Sit on down, we got a lot to talk about. This series differs from the most recent Disney Plus series in Secret Invasion because it starts with the Marvel fanfare, which ends with Loki's colorway at the end. And the episode's title, Ouroboros, is a nod to one of the show's star cast members played by Ki-Hu Kwan, who, by the way, cried when he found out that he was actually getting the part to be inside of the MCU. He was so overwhelmed when he found out that he had to pull over because he had tears in his eyes. I don't think that there's anyone any more deserving than Ki-Hu Kwan inside of the MCU, and it just gets better because he's there. But I'm fanboying just a little bit too much here, but also stands for what we could be in for in terms of this series, because the words symbol symbolizes eternity, which is what we saw being woven into this story as it was told. The action fully begins with the continuation of what happened in episode 6 of season 1. And in this sequence, we are greeted by large statues of Kang, and the camera pans back from Kang, or from the Kang statues, as if Kang is actually watching the events unfold inside of the TVA. And Kang's statues are only available or seen in the past. An odd turn of events, because this version of the TVA seems a little bit more futuristic than the one we saw previously. And in the exchange between Mobius and Loki in the beginning, Mobius says, "I don't know you," meaning that no one possibly in this version of the TVA in the past has seen Loki at all, or any version of him for that matter, which also means that they haven't seen or understood who Sylvie is yet either. Or they possibly could have just started or completed a brain wipe, which we've seen or see inside of this episode that does happen or has happened in the past.
Then again, if that's the case, why would Sylvie be stuck in the elevator?
Great question, Little Cap. I don't know yet. As Loki falls into the flying taxi, we see the numbers 435, which is a possible subtle nod to the Mighty Thor comics issue 435, where the Mighty Thor, or Thor 2, rescues Odin from Annihilus, who resides in the negative zone, which is what the quantum realm is actually based on. And as the taxi crashes into the statue, you can see that the environment behind it is mirrored, with the top mirroring the bottom. And this Jetsons Brady Bunch styled fusion TV looks like a older version or older model of the timeline monitor that has now gone haywire. Casey is listening to the same podcast that Stephen Grant from Moon Knight was listening to not go to sleep, which is exactly the same thing that he is trying not to do as well. And I love how Loki says she'll be fine after clearly recognizing or witnessing the opposite.
This is not a test, it's the real deal. Help me. Help me.
And then Loki time slips into a branch of the timeline where you fist bump the like button for me, because that tells the YouTube algorithm that everything that I'm talking about at this moment is actually helpful and entertaining. Or if any of my theories actually get you to thinking, share this with a friend. Loki time slips again, but this time it's back to the present. And by the way, time slipping can also be linked to the Spider-Verse's glitching. In Across the Spider-Verse, characters are shown to glitch in universes that are different from their own. And the visual representation of glitching is very similar to time slipping inside of Loki. And in this sequence, we gain our first look on how time is going to work now, because actions that just took place moments ago in the past now shine through inside of the present, where Loki is currently experiencing his conversation with Casey, specifically pointing out the new feature of the cracked floor inside of the TVA. Casey is then seen holding the TVA handbook, which is the same handbook that we later find out was written by Obi. And as Casey is explaining the whereabouts of Hunter 15 and Mobius, we hear the effects of time slipping in the background, allowing the audience to understand and feel the discomfort of time slipping from the audio. And when you get this in surround sound with complete Dolby Digital sound, It is completely freaky. The first time that I saw or experienced this episode was in a theater for a fan event, and my goodness, with Dolby audio and all that kind of stuff, it is very freaky to hear time slipping from an audio perspective. After the Loki title card, we are greeted with the timeline monitor, which brings us into the scene with a pullback, which is pretty similar to the way that we ended season 1 of it with episode 6. So it's a nice touch to see that this is kind of tying up some loose ends in the way that this is shot and bringing what happened before to the forefront. As Mobius and Hunter 15 discuss further actions, we see our first power blip inside of the TVA. More on what I believe that might be later on in the video. Leave what you believe that is down in the comments. Inside of their conversation, Mobius mentions how hard it would be to explain what's going on inside of the TVA right now, saying everything you've been doing is wrong and all your gods are dead, which shines a light on something that Mobius and Hunter 15 are already coming to grips with. Everything that they know and have seen has been a lie and is changing at the same time. After Mobius finds out that Loki was in reach again, he attempts to find him. Notice he immediately tries to contact Miss Minutes, who at this point is unavailable, which makes sense because she was at the Citadel and is in the trailers as a menace, which possibly means that she is working or being controlled by Kang or He Who Remains or Victor Timely, or all of them one and the same. We then get to meet a new Hunter, Hunter X5, played by Rafael Casal, who you may remember from the film Blindspotted. He then asks Mobius about jet skis on the sacred timeline,
which no longer exists.
As Mobius answers the question, we start to peel back layers on what his life actually looked like on the timeline. Because if you pay close attention in his answer, he completely loses himself for a second. And we see the jet ski salesman start to come out.
Skis, everyone thinks that it's a personal watercraft, and it's actually a brand, same way Kleenex is.
So much to the point that X5 has to reel him in because he's going off on a tangent. He literally says,
Mobius, I don't care.
In the next breath, X5 mentions that Renslayer is gone. Because if you remember, she went off inside of a time door in search of the him Miss Minutes told her about. And we get our first jump scare of the series. And again, I experienced this inside of a theater as well, and I was jumping out of my skin. Good job, audio department, because Casey's response was me. And as we pan away from Casey, we now get a glimpse of the bulging timeline, which doesn't even fit on the screen anymore. The power blips continue as Loki time slips, leading us into the past again, into what looks like a Mount Rushmore of Kang variants. And we actually find out that this was actually built over to continue the lie of the timekeepers. When we cut back to the present, we can see the stark difference in the wall that there are only 3 figures instead of 5, which demonstrates that He Who Remains went through great lengths to win the multiversal war, and when he did, he casted large shadows to cover up anything that said otherwise. And as we cut back to the present, we hear the announcement from Loki that the TVA is not real.
You're all variants. Everyone who works at the TVA.
Notice that X5 is kneeling next to General Dox, whispering, and when 15 and Mobius arrive, he stands up really quickly. But later on, we see him and Dox whispering again, almost like she's his handler. And also, this guy sleeps through the entire meeting, all of it. How? The message of Loki is being played via the tape player in the corner, which is the same player that we later hear the voice of He Who Remains talking to Ravonna.
For us, for all time.
Always.
Also, something that struck me as odd. In terms of He Who Remains covering things up, why were the Rushmore faces of himself covered up, but the other faces portray other variants, it looks like, or other variants of other people, not covered up? Case in point, the face behind the head judge, which to me looks like a variant of Ravonna. As Loki plays the record, we hear the voice of He Who Remains and Ravonna in their first, or the first ever conversation inside of the MCU on screen. He mentions the war, which is obviously speaking about the multiversal war that was spoken of in episode 6. And when Loki rewinds and plays it back, we hear where the TVA slogan comes from, which the always is spoken by Ravonna, and there's a reason why I'm pointing that out specifically here. The way that she says it made me think that she possibly could be an earlier version of Miss Minutes, given the fact that Ravonna seems to have been a key cog inside of the multiversal war, reason why He Who Remains was able to win it, which is similar to the way that Miss Minutes seems to run the entirety of the TVA. Also keep in mind that Ravonna seems to have been one of the first Minutemen inside of the TVA, which is also why possibly she became one of the head judges preceding this time period. Back in the war room, the head judge mentions that Hunter D90 just testified moments earlier that he did see Ravonna's variant on the timeline, which is what was seen in season 1. And Hunter X5's obsession with keeping things on the record seems a little sus to me. But by the way, those are some really dope gloves that he's wearing with his swag on it. Just saying. Mobius mentions that the sky hasn't fallen yet, and X5 rebuts, saying, "What sky are you looking at? Are you seeing this dead robot head on the table?"
That is a man's head.
Hunter B15 makes mention that General Dox disregards her order for protocol, as she speaks completely off the record multiple times because her station doesn't illuminate when she talks. B15 is able to convince the head judge that lives on the timeline are much more important than pruning and conserving a sacred timeline is. And though her intentions are well-mannered or well-informed, she has no idea what she is opening a can of worms for. Loki time slips back into the war room. And again, this guy is sleeping through the entire thing. How are you sleeping through time slipping? That stuff is loud. When he mentions that they found him, he realizes what has been covered up and uses a time stick to remove it. And the fact that he is able to do this or reveal this with a time stick means that the Time Variance Authority worked in this manner the entire time, though Mobius believed that it didn't.
Mobius, by the way, how long have you been here? I don't know, it's hard to say. You know, time passes differently here in the TVA.
And again, I have to bring this up. The relationship between General Dox and X5 just seems really, really odd. And just, I don't know how to say it. It just makes me feel icky inside. Almost as if she is his handler and she works kind of like a CIA agent inside of the TVA. But in the next scene, we get a deeper explanation on the multiversal war inside of the panels behind Loki and Mobius. Which, if you don't remember how that was explained inside of the MCU, let me refresh you. A really smart guy named Nathaniel Richards went on a time traveling journey. In his adventures, he encountered different versions of himself, some good, some bad. The bad versions wanted to take control, and so they fought over and over and over again until only one of them remained. In the conversation, Loki makes mention of how Sylvie actually thought about the timeline, saying that we thought it was about freeing the timeline, but that just causes more chaos, more of him, which is what I was alluding to earlier in the video with regards to B15. Loki also makes mention that he and Sylvie fought because she believed that killing He Who Remains was the only way to stop all of this chaos from her point of view, which the fight ended in a draw. Per Loki. And when Loki shows the paintings to Mobius, it's as if he's never seen these paintings in his life, and levels of the TVA are just opening up in front of him as we speak. Then Mobius asks for an explanation on how Loki just appeared inside of the war room. Because remember, this is the first time this version of Mobius actually has seen Loki since he was kicked through the time door. Because before, the previous version saw him in the past for the very first time. Mobius then attempts to call Miss Minutes, but Loki stops him cold because he understands that she cannot be trusted because she was with him at the end of time. And if we pay close attention to the elevator, we possibly could be looking at Norse runes instead of actual letters here. But I'm still dissecting on exactly what those are, so that's coming in a future video. And we get a classic Owen Wilson scene where he finally comes clean to Loki about how time slipping actually looks on the outside looking in. And it's actually very painful, or at least it looks very painful, and he describes it in detail, which ends with a beautiful camera pan, again, a classic Owen Wilson situation, when he says,
How does it look?
To a part of the elevator that we didn't even know was there. As Loki and Mobius switch to different elevators, we get a glimpse of two posters which seems to be inside of a cafeteria, which one of them says limit chit chat and keep your lunch to a limit of 17 minutes, which is different from the actual normal world of 30 minutes that most of us are used to, but they are probably trying to limit unwanted talking because remember, every word has to be logged inside of the record, as was established in the first episode of season 1 of Loki. In the transition, we see a mail worker who looks like the TVA's version of UPS. We also see a poster that says catch a nexus, prevent a red line, meaning that the TVA is aware of beings like Wanda, and this poster was also seen in the chase scene in episode 1. And the moment that we meet Obi for the first time is classic. And in his introduction, we learn that Obi has been hard at work for over 400 years with hardly a visitor, let alone any other workers in the same vicinity of him, meaning that he's the sole engineer for the TVA entirely, though he believes that he's a part of a team. But in the comics though, there were a few iterations of Ouroboros. The representation of Ouroboros in Marvel Comics starts with Oculus Ouroboros. Oculus Ouroboros is introduced as a conduit for elemental magic, which depicts a variation of the classic Ouroboros shape. In fact, Dr. Doom actually tried to harness the power of Oculus Ouroboros, though he was stopped by Dr. Strange. And then there's Admiral Ouroboros, who appeared in 2015's Silver Surfer Volume 7, number 11. And in that, he is depicted as an antagonistic character who comes face to face with the Silver Surfer after he becomes trapped in a time loop, which is reminiscent to what happened to Loki when he was trapped in a time loop with Lady Sif. And there's a cylinder that looks like the temporal loom behind Obi. During the exchange about the temporal extractor, Mobius asks if he has one, which by the way, the one that he actually does have has a TVA symbol on the top of it. Obi then explains how to remedy time slipping in the TVA. And from his explanation, you have to have someone in the time that you want to actually be in extract you from the time stream using a temporal extractor, which at this point means pruning. However, this explanation further explains or connects the glitching from across the Spider-Verse, because there's a running theory inside of the MCU community that glitching only happens due to technology and science. But you do not encounter any of that if you travel through magic. So everything inside of the TVA has been engineered and created by tech and science when it comes to time and time travel. And this had no effect inside of the TVA because up until now, there was no effective time travel inside of the TVA. And if we're talking about that particularly, we can also look at the same technology inside of Endgame as well. So there's a possibility that glitching or time slipping possibly was a thing, we just didn't know about it until now. And in the inside of the banter between Obi and Mobius, we get a gotta be quicker than that reference.
Oh, you almost had it. You gotta be quicker than...
Obi mentions something very key in terms of what pruning actually does. He mentions that when someone is pruned, they are released from time, which allows for extraction.
Right. right, your point.
I'm getting there. Chill. Before I was rudely interrupted, that means what we saw in episode 6 in terms of the end of time is really just a holding place. So does that mean that Alioth is just a fancy temporal extractor who erases memories and then places people back in the sacred timeline? The black hole line from Obi to Mobius seems to be a nod to what Wanda did to Mr. Fantastic inside of Multiverse of Madness. After Mobius and Loki come to grips with having their skin ripped off and atoms ripped through time, the light next to Obi starts to flicker, which is something that Obi has said that he's been experiencing all day. So here's what I believe the power blips, yes, I'm still calling them power blips because what else are we gonna call them? Here's what I believe that they actually mean. During his 400+ year run, it's alluded to that this has never happened before. And at this point, the temporal loom is completely overactivated right now, which seems like a logical way of explaining away what's happening. But remember, Kang is still inside of the timeline from what we saw at the end of Quantumania, and it was not established that he died. It was implied, but never established.
Look at this. Somebody come look at this. Look at this. Somebody come and look at this.
So it's possible that the blips inside of the electrical current could be Kang trying to extract himself from the time stream.
Or could it be Wanda?
It could be Wanda. Well, now I have to go rethink my whole thing. But as the gang is walking down to the temporal core area, we get our first MCU hero shot of the series as everyone is walking down the core hallway. And the reason why Wanda was brought up, a light breaks as the crew reaches the main door. The only reason I got. In this same sequence, we see a poster behind with safety protocols for the temporal core. As we pan over to the room where it happens, we see on the floor a warning which reads, "Danger, temporal radiation levels escalate exponentially beyond this point. Likelihood of spaghettification increases by 7,000%. Proceed with caution." Which brings back that spaghetti comment that Obi mentioned earlier. Also, as the door opens, we get a slight nod to the X-Men and we can see the TVA sign on the floor as well. But this initially made me think of the Shining scene from Ready Player One. Obi explains how the timeline actually works and how the temporal loom has kept it all together, explaining that the temporal loom is the heart of the TVA, taking raw time and converting it into physical timeline. But it is not constructed to weave together so many new branches, which is why it is overloading. And as branches shoot off, we actually see them as colorful rays shooting in every direction, which is exactly what we would see inside of the monitor for the TVA. And in my opinion, the temporal loom is actually revealed to be the red line for the TVA, which is the through line or the thing that we've been trying to keep sacred here. Mobius makes mention to how often Obi actually came down to this area because the computer is very dusty. But Obi explains that he never really had to because Miss Minutes was keeping track and holding together all of this. Obi then explains how to stop or control the chaos that is happening with the temporal loom, which basically is pruning the timeline branches. Hunter B-15 does not want that to happen and vehemently fights against it. So that means that Obi has to resort to the blast doors being brought down, which is a odd subtlety here because Obi literally thought of everything that could possibly go wrong inside of the TVA without ever knowing or having a preconceived idea of what would go wrong. And you can also still see that Mobius is still thinking about the fact that his skin could be peeled off of his body because he writes skin inside of the dust on the computer. Loki then time slips again after finding out that General Dox is raiding the armory of the TVA, which signals that she is going after Sylvie. Notice the blast doors have now come down, which signifies that we are in the future. Loki understands this because of the word skin with the question mark still being written inside of the computer dust, and he realizes that what he needs to find now is a time stick. We then cut back to Obi and Mobius heading into the loom, and I love the way that Obi gives him this big rah-rah speech, making him ready to tackle the world, and when Mobius actually believes it and buys into it, ready to go out and tackle the loom, Obi just gives him a, okay, bro, what? You just did all of that and now you just gonna give me an okay? I'm about to risk my life. Also, the moment when Mobius realizes that his helmet is cracked seems like a poke at the I can fix anything with duct tape and a stick of bubble gum. And I can't help but think that this is another MCU Among Us reference, which also came inside of Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 as well.
That game had everyone in a chokehold. I mean, the MCU included, huh?
But as Mobius steps out of the door for the TVA, you can see the slogan for the TVA, for all time, always. We snap back to the future time that Loki is in.
Oh, there goes gravity.
And again, we understand that the blast doors have been fully brought down, which apparently sends the TVA into a red alert. And as the camera frantically follows Loki through the TVA, we get another glimpse of the timeline monitor, but this time something different has occurred. We see Loom Critical, which basically is an establishment, or basically because it has now been established inside of the MCU, we can now reference it and point to it being the catalyst for what is going on inside of the TVA right now. The loom does not work initially when the extractor is connected to it, which then causes Obi to go back to the computer to allow it to fire, or reprogram it to allow it to fire. But it also could have been the kick that Mobius gave it as well. And again, as we get back to where Loki is, we get right back to where the episode began, but this time there are no statues of Kang, as if to say that now that I'm closer to being in this thing, I don't have to watch it anymore. I'm about to be inside of it directly. Then as Mobius gets the extractor to fire directly into the timeline, we get a Matrix type of reference when Loki realizes that the loom has fired. In the background, a phone starts to ring and continues to ring as Loki approaches it. And in the same moment, we see Sylvie coming out of an elevator, which is in front of Loki, which is a real sighting of Sylvie by, or given by, the fact that Loki actually has tears in his eyes. So did Mobius from the future prune Loki? Also, the moment from the trailer with the big red button that I talked about in my trailer explain video is carried out by who I thought it was. It is Obi Ki-Hu Kwan as he prepares to close the blast door. Then General Dox and her Minutemen are seen taking the full force of the TVA into a time door, which seems like way more firepower than would be needed to stop Sylvie. Is her plan to wipe out everything in hopes of also destroying Sylvie as well? It's a little bit overkill, bruh. Like, what exactly is she planning? You don't need that much firepower just to fight Sylvie. I'm real skeptical on the fact that she needs all of this just to take down Sylvie. Listen, hear me out.